He was an idealist, but he was also an internationalist when you consider his willingness to make arrangements with other countries. For example, when considering the Paris Climate Agreement or the Iran nuclear deal. The Iran nuclear deal, while a prime example of Sachs internationalism, also contained elements of realist thought since it was designed to appease Iran and balance nuclear powers. In addition to this, it could also be seen as a form of American exceptionalism to suppose that the U.S. would need to play a leading role in an Iranian nuclear deal because Iran's a separate country. So therefore, the U.S.'s role would be seen as exceptionalism, that it can intervene, as opposed to, say, the UN or some other international alliance. If one agreement can be viewed with so many different lenses, that is, the Iran nuclear deal can be viewed as a realist, idealist, internationalist, and also so realist, idealist, internationalist, and idealist. If it can be viewed through all those different lenses, then it doesn't seem like these frames are very useful. I have to question either the validity of these lenses or my understanding of these lenses. And this is not the only exception, or not the only example. Bush Jr., for example, was considered a liberal idealist when he intended to spread democracy through war. However, you also had realists like Kissinger and Powell both endorse the Iraq War. So was that war an act of liberal idealism, or was it an act of realism? I guess that's something people debate, but this is where I'm confused. And I could use some more education on this. However, one thing I did note about Sachs' ideology is his opinion on Russia. He talks about there being the need for more collaboration with Russia. I found this somewhat offensive, or a misrepresentation of the events that went on between the U.S. and Russia as to what motivated Russia to act hostilely towards Ukraine. Now I'm about to go on a tangent. For those who know me, this is not a topic I'm either indifferent or ill-informed on. In fact, the Russia-Ukrainian war is a large reason why I'm reading foreign policy books like Sachs and making videos about them. But in any case, Sachs, like many others, believes that in the new Putin era of Cold War, so Sachs believes in the new Putin era Cold War that it would have been better had we collaborated with Russia, and that this would have prevented the current Cold War crisis. Sachs himself was an advisor to the Polish economic reform, and he later was an advisor to Gorbachev and Yeltsin when they embraced economic shock therapy. So one would assume he knows what he's talking about, except for the fact that other experts do disagree with him. Michael McFaul, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, would be one example. Sachs words his position as such, quote, "When Vladimir Putin succeeded Boris Yeltsin in 2000, Putin still expressed the hope for improved relations with the United States and Europe. Yet the following decade would poison the well. The U.S. lack of assistance to Russia in the early 1990s had been the first snub. American complicity in the rise of the oligarch was the second grievance. The third cause of rupture was U.S. military policy, notably the expansion of NATO to the east and increased U.S. meddling in the Middle East." End quote. Now, for those who know history of Russia in the 90s, it wasn't pretty. St. Petersburg, Putin's city, was a city in which crime was the dominant political force, and it's estimated that millions of people died during the process of converting a socialist state, the USSR, going from a controlled economy to a market-based economy. Millions died in that process. For Russians, and not so much Poles, this would entail a human catastrophe. While it's questionable whether Putin was referring to this crisis when he said the collapse of the USSR was the greatest human catastrophe of the 20th century, he would not necessarily be wrong, or he would not be that far off to say that it was probably the greatest catastrophe for Russians. The effects were actually worse than any war that the U.S. ever went to. However, Sachs, instead of taking blame that his ideas may have helped Poland but hurt Russia, he instead blames the assistance provided by the U.S. The U.S. provided a team of economic experts to advise Yeltsin, known as the Harvard Boys. While their solutions had a disastrous effect, it's a mistake to suppose that Russia had no assistance from the West. Russians were, after all, not obliged to accept the US's suggested reforms. Meanwhile, Yeltsin's own political regime owes a great deal to the US, as the US assisted Yeltsin in overthrowing his own parliament in 1993 and replacing it with the State Duma. Later, the US advised the OSCE, or some European Eurasian organization, to not investigate Yeltsin's rigging of the 1996 election. Russian society might complain about US involvement in Russia's transformation, but the ruling factions have very little credibility when their regimes personally benefited from US interaction with Russia. Putin, by extension, only became president after Yeltsin made him his prime minister. During the 90s, the US provided aid to Russia and spent over $1 billion in attempting to help them adapt a democratic system. While this assistance might seem light in comparison to Poland or Eastern Europe, it can't be said that the US didn't assist Russia. More importantly, NATO expansion is presented by Sachs as a form of military opportunism at the expense of Russia. What's missing from this is that the US did not so much push for Eastern Europe to join NATO so much as Eastern Europe pushed to be included in NATO. In the aftermath of the Warsaw Pact, the only military alliance to ever invade itself, in the aftermath of the Warsaw Pact, that is the only military alliance to ever invade itself, many countries were looking for a safeguard from Russian expansionism. In the 90s, this thought was laughable to the West, but for those who lived under Russian rule and were familiar with Russian society, they knew they were always at risk being so close to Russia. While it is more by all accounts true that James Baker While it is by most accounts true that James Baker promised Gorbachev not to expand NATO, this deal was being made with Gorbachev and not Yeltsin. Yeltsin contrarily attempted to join NATO, and Putin did the same, according to his 2024 Tucker Carlson interview. Meanwhile, according to Shevel and Popova's book, entitled Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States, the 1997 NATO-Russia founding document nullified Russia's veto in NATO expansion. Putin, for his own part, in 2002, worded Ukraine's NATO membership as such. I am absolutely convinced that Ukraine will not shy away from the process of expanding interactions with NATO and Western allies as a whole. Ukraine has its own relations with NATO. There is the NATO-Ukraine Council. At the end of the day, the decision is to be taken by NATO and Ukraine. It is a matter for those two partners. McFaul, in his 2022 debate with John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt on Russia's security concerns, offered a similar quote from Dmitry Medvedev. It is my opinion that NATO expansion became a politically viable security complaint in the Russian society only after Putin and Medvedev made the choice to move away from Western influence. This was not a concern during the War on Terror, when Putin was more than happy to have US or NATO troops use Russian military bases in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. So, to summarize my position, I don't believe you can try to join NATO and then complain about NATO becoming larger. I find that somewhat hypocritical. I also believe the agreement that was made between Gorbachev and James Baker was nullified when the Soviet Union was dissolved, because there were now other factors or other political entities to consider. So Gorbachev could speak for the Warsaw Pact when the Warsaw Pact still existed. But Gorbachev and Yeltsin do not have the authority over Ukraine, Poland, or other independent sovereign countries. The Belovezha Accords that nullified the Soviet Union and gave independence to the former Soviet republics and to the other Warsaw Pact countries gave these countries the right to self-determination. Joining NATO would be such a right. The agreement that James Baker made with Gorbachev regarding NATO expansion was also made on the condition that Russia needed to democratize. This is according to the book NATO by Sten Reining. And there are good reasons to suppose that Russia violated this agreement, whether it be Yeltsin's coup in 1993 or the 1996 or 2012 rigged elections. Albeit that, the 1996 rigged election, it appears the U.S. had a hand in that too. So, but still, you don't see a democratic Russia, so it doesn't make sense to make this condition for NATO expansion when Gorbachev was offering a democratized Soviet Union. And Gorbachev, to his credit, did implement perestroika and glasnost, I think it is. But not to say that Gorbachev was perfect, just he did do those two things. In any case, NATO expansion is something that can only happen with unilateral consensus. The NATO-Russian Joint Council was founded explicitly for the purpose of consulting Russia on NATO expansion, and when faced with opposition, Western countries often chose Russia's concerns. The lesson from the 2008 Bucharest summit is often presented that the statement on Ukraine joining NATO provoked Russia. What's missing is the actual protests from NATO members that resulted in Ukraine not being offered a membership plan. Because there is a need for unanimous consensus from NATO members before they can admit new members, it was never a realistic proposition that Ukraine would join NATO. France and Italy opposed the idea precisely because they didn't want to anger Russia. So let's get back to Sachs. Sachs wrote this book in 2018. Before the 2022 invasion, when Russia had annexed Crimea and was denying direct involvement in the eastern Ukrainian Donbass war. That's the period in which Sachs wrote this book. These results were the immediate aftermath of the Euromaidan, or Revolution of Dignity. These events, that is, Russia involved in Ukraine. It was the immediate aftermath of the Revolution of Dignity, where Ukraine overthrew an oligarch. The catalyst for this NATO membership, as Ukraine was enshrined as constitutionally neutral at that point. That is to say, the catalyst for Russia invading was not NATO, but was this revolution. At that point in time, Ukraine was a constitutionally neutral country. During the talks between Russia and the Western leaders, such as the agreement on settlement of political crisis in Ukraine, that is the talk that took place on February 21st, 2014, or during the numerous talks between Putin and Yanukovych, during these talks, the subject of NATO did not come up once. Rather, as Shevell and Popova noted in their book, what Russia was afraid of was not a military threat, but the loss of the ability to blackmail and control Ukraine as its vassal state. Putin, in his own interview with Oliver Stone, ironically had the ultimate assessment of this arrangement of Ukraine joining the EU. He said, "Of course, if Ukraine has come to this decision to join the EU, this is its choice and we respect this choice." He made this statement during an interview with Oliver Stone. Since Sachs has written his book in 2017, we have seen more of Russia's desire to dominate by evidence of the 2022 invasion. We've also seen that NATO is not quite as big of a concern as we thought it was. The Trump administration, with the rest of NATO, has officially disbanded the rhetoric of the 2008 Bucharest summit. As of March 2025, there is not even the hypothetical plan to include Ukraine in NATO in the future. This is according to Mark Rutte and Donald Trump, yet this change in policy did nothing to move Russia closer to a ceasefire. Now, Sachs' book is not really about Russia and Ukraine, or the US, NATO, and Russian relations, but his main contention is that it's better to work together with different countries on common grounds than to form competitions. I don't disagree with this. Russia and NATO collaborate quite well on the war on terror. Putin was the first on 9/11 to send his regards to George W. Bush, and as I already mentioned, he let the US use Russian military bases. The US and Russia do have common interests and some things they can collaborate on. However, US collaborations with Russia does not appear to be the answer to how the US can help Ukraine maintain sovereignty. Quite the opposite, it seemed like appeasing Russia was the reason why Russia was able to invade Ukraine. Now on to other matters. In the chapters following this topic, Sachs discusses America's wars of choice. Here he shows himself to be an idealist in recognizing the immoral nature of American wars. He covers a broad perspective of different conflicts, but nearly always recognizes that the U.S. was not attacked and therefore did not need to get involved. The only two conflicts he justifies are the Korean War and World War II. In the Middle East, he is particularly clear that he believes the local powers have a better remedy to the situation, and believes that this is a prime example of how American exceptionalism failed and how collaboration with Turks, Arabs, Israelis, and Persians makes more sense than trying to rebuild their society. Well, Trump is likely to agree with Sachs on this point. In 2018, the most defining element of Trump's foreign policy was to take the oil and bomb the Shit out of Syria. With the current strikes on Iran, we see a similar approach to Obama trying to eliminate Gaddafi without providing any alternatives. We don't see an actual war on the ground. We don't see Trump particularly eager for this, in my own estimate. We have a lot of rhetoric about us going to Iran right now in July 2025, but I don't think it's actually going to happen or materialize for the same reason that we didn't invade Libya when we overthrew Gaddafi. Jeffrey Sachs is not shy about his opinions on Israel either. He gives a brief history of Israel and explains the 4 different positions held by both moderates and extremists on the Israel-Palestine perspective, on the Israeli and Palestinian perspectives. He gives 2 versions of the 2-state solution and 2 versions of the 1-state solution. He notes that the majority of both Arabs and Israelis favor a 2-state solution and criticizes Israel for its settlement campaigns that he views as an obstacle to this solution. Obviously, he sees the U.S. as being ideal to broker some kind of peace between these countries. What's missing from his analysis is the maximalist terms that define Hamas's political platform or any criticism of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. But this is not the only omission in Sachs' outlook. He also outlooks stuff in Russia, as I just ranted about. And I think he also overlooks a lot of the things or a lot of the reasons why the war on terror occurred. He doesn't consider the hypotheticals of the U.S. not being involved in the Middle East or what would be the alternative response after 9/11. For my own part, though, I find Sachs' outlook on foreign policy to be refreshingly optimistic. While he may be overly dismissive of America's military and security concerns, he's not someone who views America's influence as fundamentally bad. I agree with him in his advocacy for further U.S. aid and see collaboration as a necessary endeavor moving forward. While I'm not convinced that this collaboration will prevent China from invading Taiwan, nor do I think it can solve the current Russo-Ukrainian war, nor do I think Sachs would claim collaboration can solve all problems, but I don't think it's wrong to attempt collaboration. While his views expressed throughout the book do not strike me as that of a Christian, his moral assertions regarding the development of nations and their obligation, his moral assertions regarding developed nations and their obligations to the developing world reflects my understanding of Christian ethics. He quotes scripture in Pope Paul VI's encyclical in order to illustrate his point, and I appreciate this. Anyway, this is my summary of Jeffrey Sachs' A New Foreign Policy. It's a bit bland in presentation, but I just wanted to get through my main takeaways. If you like this video and want me to make more like it, feel free to subscribe. Or if you feel like I left out any important details, or if I misrepresented Sachs' argument, feel free to comment below. In any case, take care.